What's up everybody, how's it going? It's Burke, aka Dansg08 here, and welcome to a very special video on this channel. This video is quite literally more than 10 years in the making because I did my first ever Final Fantasy playthrough on the channel over 10 years ago in 2014, and ever since then I was on a mission to try and complete every single Final Fantasy single player title on the channel. Now it literally has taken me 10 years to do that, and throughout that journey a lot of them I got to experience for the first time. And I got to gradually build more and more of an opinion of what I like and how I compare the games in my mind. Now, of course, over the years, a lot of people have asked me, how do you rank the games? How do you compare this aspect, that aspect? And it's something I've tried to generally hold off talking about. I'll often discuss maybe, well, my favorite game or my top 3 or something like that, but I don't go too deep and try to produce like a full ranking or a list of the games. But now, I think it's time to do that, because what I said to people always was that I'd like to finish all of the games first so that I have an actual opinion on all of them, having played through everything at least once, and then we can begin the Dansg08 era of rankings and tier lists. And so that day is finally here, so I'm very excited to be able to share this new type of content with you. So how it's going to work is that I was torn between ranking them versus tier listing them, and in my head, Final Fantasy is so difficult for me to truly rank because to me, so many of the games are so close to each other. They're both very different and very similar at the same time for like certain eras and that kind of thing. So I thought I'm not going to commit to a pure ranking video. I like the tier list format because it helps to obviously group things together a little more. So the way I'm going to do it is to create my own tier list. And that way, if there's multiple games within the same tier, if I rank one higher than the other within that tier, okay, fine. I mean, I've put that one above that one, but it doesn't mean that in my mind there's a particularly big difference between them. It's more just kind of separation for the sake of separation. And I think that way I can kind of hit both sides. I can technically rank all of the games while also making it a little bit more easier to kind of, I think, literally compartmentalize and to put them in those type of tiers. So I think that's the way I wanted to do it. Tier lists aren't the type of format that I've really watched very much myself, so this is going to be my own take on how to do it. I think the only thing that I was thinking about was trying to make sure I don't make the videos super long. I don't want to spend a crazy amount of time like discussing and defending every single opinion that I post here. I wanted to basically share the list, maybe just spend like a very short amount of time just giving some general information and like just my feeling on it, and then basically leave it at that and let people kind of share their own comments and their own feelings and that kind of thing. And maybe one day, depending on the video and depending how it does, I can potentially go back and almost kind of react to and reanalyze these tier list videos and see if I feel the same like a year later, 3 years later, 5 years later, or if people really want me to dig deeper into why I made these choices, then I can do a more kind of in-depth, like hour-long, 2-hour-long video where I go into basically every single game and why I made those particular decisions, because we have a lot of them to get through at this stage. I mean, it's 1 all the way through to 16, and we've obviously got games like 13, which are a trilogy, then you've got Final Fantasy X and X-2, then you've got the remakes of 7, so in total there's going to be a lot of games covered here, and so I'm going to try to get through them a little bit more quickfire and give you guys the information that you want for the video. So that's going to be the format. I hope you guys enjoy it. I'm looking forward to trying to create this type of format for the first time. This is going to be like my kind of gut reaction / feeling kind of tier list and ranking, and I wanted to just go with that. And when I see the game and I need to put it in a tier list, especially once I start to kind of put them in a tier list, I can kind of almost have more of a visual way of seeing how I put them thus far, and I can get a better feel for where each game belongs. I think the first few will be difficult, and maybe throughout the video I'll kind of chop and change a little bit as I go. So stay tuned until the end, because there might be some games where I like gut reaction put in a tier, and then once the list starts to build, I might be like, whoa, actually hold on, this doesn't feel right, maybe that game belongs in this tier or that tier. So yeah, just bear with me as a first attempt to make this type of video. Let's get going with this list. It's going to be 1 through to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth most recently. It's going to be the single player mainline titles. So it's not going to include things like Tactics, which I already haven't played, but even if I did, I wouldn't include Tactics here. It's not going to include Final Fantasy XI and 14 because they're multiplayer games. I haven't played them. But I think this list should cover a lot of games and help to give you more of an insight of where I'm at with my experience with these games after playing all of them over the last 10 years. So let's get into it and begin the tier list. Okay, my friends, welcome to the Dansg08 Final Fantasy tier list. As you can see, we've got ranges from S down to D. In general, obviously, I'm a big fan of the franchise. I love so many of the games. My overall feeling and sentiment on Final Fantasy is very positive. And so I don't have a lot of games that are going to go down in the D tier. D for me is I didn't enjoy it very much. For me, if I had an F tier or something like that, it would be totally terrible. I really thought this game sucked and was bad. D is okay, fine, I play through it, but it didn't really leave that much of a positive impact on me. So I think that's the best way I can explain it. And as you can see at the top end, I literally have A+, and S. I have 3 separate tiers for A and above. So you get the idea. Obviously, I'm a fan of the franchise. It's going to be kind of top heavy, but hopefully there's enough tiers here for me to differentiate the games, which is more, I think, what I'd like to do by the end of this video. If you guys want me to do more of an in-depth, talk about this tier list for an hour and a half, I'll see the response, and depending on things, I might try to do an extended cut in the future. But for now, the focus is on trying to just commit to a tier and a position, and just kind of move things along at a relatively good pace. So, let's begin with the daddy, Final Fantasy I. This game for me goes in B tier. I enjoyed it, and I have, of course, a profound respect and appreciation for this game because it is, of course, the one that started it all. Laid down a lot of foundations for what happened later. A lot of great things can be attributed to Final Fantasy I, so it's just hard for me to put it anything lower because, yeah, it's a fun game, good game. The turn-based system I still just naturally gravitate to a little bit more. Just the establishment of sort of the visual design, the music, the bosses, the dungeons, the boss, all that stuff. One obviously just laid down a lot of great work for the rest of the series. Now, of course, compared to what came afterwards, I think I just can't rank it that high because I come from a background of starting from the PS2 era / PS3 era and then working my way backwards. And so, of course, it's very hard for a game made in 1987 to compete with the likes of anything that came out from the PS1 era onwards. But all that said, huge game, very important, and I still had a good time with it, so it belongs for me in the B tier for now. As I place more games around it, maybe things will shuffle around, but I think I'm happy with B for now. So, Final Fantasy II, I think, is going to go in the D tier. This was the game where I kind of would have expected it to improve on Final Fantasy I a little bit more. Obviously, 1 is kind of the pilot game, but it didn't really bring with it the kind of improvements I would have hoped. And I think some of the decisions they made and things that they tried to do, if anything, that it was worse than Final Fantasy I. So 2 for me never really clicked. I didn't really like the gameplay in terms of the progression systems and all of that kind of stuff. And I just felt like it wasn't the progression that I had hoped. And so I'm going to say 2 belongs in the D tier for now. Definitely wasn't one that I particularly enjoyed. Now, Final Fantasy III, I'm going to put in the B tier. I'm going to put it above Final Fantasy I. So what this means here is that even if they're in the same tier, if I have to rank them, Final Fantasy III goes above Final Fantasy I. Now, the reason for that is because 3 was the first one I played from the pre-Final Fantasy IV era, and I had low expectations for it, because 4 I always heard was the one where it really started to bring in more of an element of the cast, the story, the scale, all of that stuff. 1, 2, and 3, they're much more the shorter games. They're not as deep on the story or the character and any of that kind of stuff. And those are things I tend to gravitate to more in Final Fantasy games. But 3 had a killer soundtrack, some really, really good environmental music in that game. I really liked the pacing of the game. The length and the pacing was actually still quite nice. Definitely shorter than the games that came after it, but it felt tight. It didn't feel repetitive or boring or anything like that. And I think the Pixel remaster went a long way in keeping the experience smooth and just really still a lot of fun for someone like me coming back from playing the modern era game. So 3, I think, had a lot going for it. And I think because it kind of slightly surprised me a little bit and exceeded expectations, had a nice world map, and the way that it changes throughout the game, you had the flooded world and stuff. All of that stuff I think was really cool to me. So 3 I will put in the B tier. Final Fantasy IV, got to put this in A. As I've alluded to already, I think for me, I still gravitate most to story and characters and the adventure that you go on together as a team. And 4 was the first game that truly did start to establish that for sure. Really like the cast, lots of cool characters, lots of funny moments, and they really tried to do something on a totally different level to what they'd done before in those regards. So of course it took the foundations that were built on, improved it, I think, like the gameplay started to get a little deeper as well, and the game started to get a bit bigger in scale, a bit more ambitious, and when they started to really add in the characters and the story and took that to another level as well, for me it belongs in a higher tier than the ones that preceded it. So Final Fantasy IV, for me, is A tier. Now, 5, I'm really torn on, because it is A tier for me, but is it here, or is it here? The reason I'm torn is because 5, I have a lot of love for a lot of the same reasons as 4, but fundamentally still quite different, because 5, I think, has one of my favorite gameplays of the entire series, really. The job system that they have in 5 is just really nice. It allows for a lot of versatility and experimentation, and you don't have to work like super hard to optimize everything and play it perfectly. Like, it's just fun. It's just a nice, good implementation. And I think for that reason, it's better than 4. But 4, for me, still, I think in terms of the story and the cast, it is superior to 5. 5, I don't like the protagonist as much. And there is a very important event that happens about midway through the story, and that kind of changes the trajectory of the game in terms of the characters and the cast for the rest of it in a way that I don't like. And so the second half of the story, in terms of the cast and stuff, just doesn't do it for me as much with 5. And so for that reason, I still keep it below 4, but I keep it in the A tier because it was just a great game and a lot of fun to play with its battle system. Now, 6 goes in S tier. It is my first S tier game. 6, I feel like, it's just the culmination of so much of the great work that had happened in the series up until this point. But it took it to another level because of the ensemble cast. Absolutely love the cast of 6, just the sheer amount of variety and different characters, and the way that they managed to weave them all into this story and give them all their own backgrounds and personalities despite the fact that they're not voice acted. The design of these characters, I was invested in pretty much all of them. Like, I wanted to know more about them. They interact well together. Lots of charm, lots of great moments. Like, Ultros is just so funny in Final Fantasy VI as well. Just a great character to bring in as well. And of course it has one of the most memorable antagonists of the series as well in Kefka. Great soundtrack, killer soundtrack. Again, the world and the sense of adventure is great. The way that things are interconnected with NPCs giving you clues on how to proceed. And then the world shifts midway through the game or later in the game to the world of Ruin. The moment with Celes, the opera, iconic moments, just great cast, great story, great adventure. Gameplay not as good as 5 for me, but still really good for its era. Just had almost everything, this game, and I was just genuinely blown away by how good Final Fantasy VI was and how they made it work. And honestly, in terms of an ensemble cast like that, it's basically something that they haven't replicated since. I think 6 is a truly special game. And now I am going to fill up the S tier once more with Final Fantasy VII. I'm going to put it here. 7, I've always said it, for me it's the greatest Final Fantasy. Not the best, which is a bit of a clue for later, but for me it's the greatest. It's the one with the strongest legacy. I think it made the most impact when it launched. It changed the game. It really did. Took Final Fantasy to a new level, and it just resonated with so many people around the world, and to this day it's still revered, it's still loved. And for me, I feel all of that. When I played Final Fantasy VII, it was, again, the first one of the PS1 era, so I think the expectations were high. I think it delivered on so many of those fronts. Great cast, one of my absolute favorite casts of the entire series. The most iconic and the most memorable, the best antagonist, I think, of the entire franchise in Sephiroth. The world map was big, ambitious, lots of towns, lots of dungeons, lots of secrets to find, optional battles, ruby weapon, emerald weapon. Then if you want to dig deeper into the story, there's lots of interesting characters like Hojo and their backstories and all the history, Vincent, Lucretia, Aerith. There's just so much going on that Final Fantasy VII, I think, is just fantastic. The soundtrack, truly iconic, not just boss battle music, but the environmental music too. There's tracks that all those years later, they're so fresh in my mind, like Cosmo Canyon and stuff. Those kind of tracks are just absolutely timeless and beautiful. And so Final Fantasy VII, for me at least, it feels like a game that really did it all. It had the soundtrack, had the visuals, had the story, had the cast, had the depth, like the themes, like Cloud's identity and his search for meaning and sense of self. And then you have like the history, the science. You got like Shinra. You've got like, you know, environmentalism. All of these things come together in this like crazy, amazing adventure. That 7 is just a spectacular game. It's amazing. I think it's so big and it's so popular that I think that brings with it some level of it's overrated and some level of hate too. But nah, I disagree. 7 is an S tier game and it's brilliant. So let's move on to Final Fantasy VIII. This one I will place in A+. Final Fantasy VIII I love a lot. 8 I think is probably one of my favorite Final Fantasies of all time in terms of just like its art direction, and it has the best soundtrack. For me, like Uematsu just got progressively like better and better and better and better. 7 was just like an S tier soundtrack, and then 8 was just like he just went god mode. He just went insane with the 8 soundtrack. It's unbelievable how good that soundtrack is. And 8 for me, again, the cast I really enjoyed. Squall I liked as a protagonist. His journey and his kind of stoic nature was really nicely balanced out by characters like Zell with his high energy and Selphie. And the journey that these kids, like school kids, go on together, I think was just really cool. I think like the locations like Estar, Lunatic Pandora, the space section of the game, just so much stuff I found like visually and just like atmospherically really inspiring and really cool. The story with the parallel story with Laguna and the kind of back and forth between them and how that story concludes. And I think what really makes Final Fantasy VIII killer for me, like amazing, for me, I think it's got to have one of the absolute best and strongest finales of any Final Fantasy. So from the moment that you enter Ultimecia Castle and you hear that music, you do like all of the puzzles and the traversal inside the castle, then you fight the multiple stages of Ultimecia with just increasingly good soundtrack. And then you get to the final form of Ultimecia and the Extreme starts playing. It's just like, how? Like, how did they create something this incredible? Then you have the final cutscene. Then you have like the wholesome, like video recorded kind of scene. Like the ending of Final Fantasy VIII is truly spectacular. And it leaves such a strong impression at the end that it's got to be A+ tier for me. Yes, junction system, that kind of thing. It has its flaws, gameplay, whatever. But for me, still, it's a great game. And I went back and I did the attack-only run of the game, and it just made me love it even more. So definite flaws, yes. But nah, special game. Love Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy IX. Ooh, this is... I'm going to put this here. A+ tier, but not better than 8. I think 9... I love the direction that they went with it in general. I really like that they didn't try to maintain like the kind of heavier, serious presentation, at least, of 7 and 8. I just love kind of the charm and the art design and the colorful nature and the different like look and feel of the towns and that kind of thing. I thought 9 was a winner for that one. I like the more upbeat, kind of funny, charismatic protagonist in Zidane. I thought that was a nice way to do it because we've had like the kind of the quieter, more stoic guys in Cloud and Squall. I think Zidane was a breath of fresh air. The interactions between Zidane, Garnet, Steiner, Freya early on. Amaran I don't love as much, but as an overall, I do like the cast of 9. They're a great bunch, with a special note, of course, for Vivi, one of, I think, the best characters created in Final Fantasy, period. And so Final Fantasy IX had a lot going for it in terms of, I think, the way it was written, that pantomime feel, the nice atmosphere. But I think the reason I can't put it above 8 is because it doesn't end as strong as 8 does, like the whole Necron stuff at the end. Just never really clicked with me. And I think like the post-game and the gameplay of 9 just wasn't snappy enough. The post-game I didn't love that much anyway, and I think the gameplay of 9 has always been a bit too slow. So I think I can't put it any higher than that. But in terms of like the adventure of 9 and the places that you go, the journey that you go on, the cast and the way that they bond together, all of those classic Final Fantasy things, I think it does a lot of things very, very well. So I think that's where it belongs for 9. It's still like a slight step up, I think, from the 4s and 5s, but not by much. I think the gap between 9 and 4 and 5 isn't that big, but I think it's enough for me to just put it into the A+ tier. Okay, Final Fantasy X. S tier, my favorite game of all time. Best Final Fantasy, not even close. For me, like the gap between 10 and 7 is actually large enough that I could put 10 in its own like separate tier, but for the sake of this list, it's my favorite game of all time. For me, it has my favorite story. has my favorite cast, has my favorite gameplay, has my second favorite soundtrack behind 8, but still, of course, incredibly strong soundtrack. When you add into it all of the context, like it was the first one I ever played, it's the one I really got immersed and obsessed with, it's the one I started the channel from, and all of the stuff that happened afterwards. Final Fantasy X has just an irreplaceable, unreachable place in my heart, so there's no way I can be completely like not biased and not talk about and bring in all of that context with Final Fantasy X, and therefore it is of course the top of the list, but I'm sure basically everyone watching already knew that. So 10 is at the top of the pile, of course, in the S tier. Now, 10-2, I think I will put this in B tier. I always say that I like the direction they went with 10. I think after how heavy 10 was and like the seriousness of how that story ended, the bittersweet stuff, like the deep kind of religious and existential stuff that goes on in 10, like all of that stuff, I think 10-2 needed to be a bit more of a breath of fresh air, considering the setting and all of that stuff. So I think they got that right, but I think 10-2, the best way I can describe it is just it's a fun game. It doesn't have sort of, I think, the immersive story, the depth, the cast, and all of that stuff to make it anywhere near for me as good as a 10. But the gameplay is fun. The characters are definitely generally fun. And of course it scores points off the back of Final Fantasy X because it's already established the world of Spira. And anyone who loves the world of Spira will automatically, I think, appreciate being able to go there and revisit locations, see characters they hadn't seen for a long time, see how things are going. Like, it's just, it fits in a very special place. And so, yeah, part of me, of course, just, I never really loved the whole Songstress Yuna, Charlie's Angels vibe of the game, but I think it still has enough going for it, and it still has a lot of fun aspects to it that I definitely still enjoyed my playthrough of 10-2. And it's a game that definitely still belongs, I think, in something like the B tier. Final Fantasy XII. I am going to put this in A tier, behind 4 and 5. 12 has probably my favorite world in all of Final Fantasy. Ivalice is incredible. The sheer scale and the variety of locations, the fullness and the richness of places like Rabanasta, and the towns, the NPCs, the different dialects, the different races, the different classes, social classes, all of these things, I think they've done a fantastic job of the world creation and the world building in 12. The sheer amount of stuff to do in the game, like the scale of the game, the amount of hunts to do, the amount of optional content that's gameplay related, I think, mostly, as opposed to trying to put in like fluffy kind of fetch questy story stuff. I think it's definitely better they did it more in terms of hunts and combat, which I definitely gravitate to a lot more. The reason it's not higher is still because I fundamentally am not as big a fan of the story mostly being told through Vaan. That still doesn't work well for me. I think there's just stronger cast members, and they're so much stronger, I think, than Vaan that it just doesn't feel right. But I think just the cast and the story never quite really did it for me, and the Gambit system I did like. It was a very different take, obviously, to what we've seen, but it was good. It wasn't like, oh, I loved the Gambit system. It was awesome. It was good, and it was refreshing. It was different to try, but I think that's where I would kind of cap it off. So Final Fantasy XII, good game, literally playing it right now. A lot of great things going for it, and it's another game I'd love to see a remake for. Someday, they remake it, and they tell the story in a slightly different way, and they handle the cast a little differently. I think it could be onto a winner and climb up the rankings even more. Final Fantasy XIII. This is where, like, this might be slightly more of a hotter take. I'm going to put Final Fantasy XIII in the A tier. Final Fantasy XIII was either the second or the third Final Fantasy I played, and the first one I played on PS3. The audio visuals of this game blew my mind. I could not believe how good this game looked, and to this day, it holds up really well. Now, if you're a person you don't care as much about that stuff, it feels superficial to you, obviously that's totally cool, and that's why we make these lists. But for me, like, because I've always had an interest, like an eye for just like visual, cinematic content, that kind of stuff. This came at a time when I was starting to develop that eye more. I was watching a lot more films, just had a lot more interest in like photography and filmmaking and just like audio-visual things. And this game just really delivered on that front, and it just still looks so nice to this day. And so that already kind of went a long way into just giving me this kind of wow factor. Because when I'm playing Final Fantasy, I want to feel like I'm transported to another world. And obviously having the visuals to really make you feel like you are in another one just made a big difference to me. And so that went a long way. And I think the gameplay, even though it was weak for like the first 60 to 70% of the game, I think it really comes along. And once I got towards nearer the end of the game, and it really unlocked the ability to do everything with the game, I started to enjoy myself a lot more with the gameplay. And I feel like there's a lot more depth there than they actually presented for much of the game. I did actually end up enjoying the gameplay, but only when you start to do more, like, you have all of the tools and you start to do more kind of high-level stuff. Downsides, I think the cast was definitely weaker than some of the best entries. Lightning was a good protagonist, but, like, not amazing. And I think just, like, the storytelling of 13 just still wasn't really there for me. Didn't enjoy it as much. But a shout-out to Chapter 11 of Final Fantasy 13. Like, that bit is S tier by itself. But I think as an overall thing, I still enjoy it a bit more than most because I like that sort of the gameplay when you're trying to do more difficult boss fights and challenges and stuff. And just the audio-visual for me, like the soundtrack is awesome. And I think if there's any aspect of 13 that really punches above its weight, it's got to be the soundtrack. Like, say what you will about the game, but the soundtrack is fantastic. So still, for me, it belongs in the A tier, but definitely I think at the bottom of the A tier, I couldn't put it above the games that are also a part of that tier. So let's move it along to 13.2. The C tier is empty at the moment, but I am about to fill it because 13.2 will go there. I think it's too different from 13 to really, like, benefit from a lot of what 13 did well. It's not as linear, so even visually, it doesn't look as good as 13 for me. It has a different protagonist, and it's one of the aspects I think is the weakest of the games. I think the whole Noel and Sarah combination doesn't work for me. They don't have the chemistry or the charisma as a duo to really carry that story as protagonists. The time-hopping stuff was ambitious, but I don't think they particularly executed it that great. And because I didn't love the cast of 13 overall that much anyway, the whole getting to see some of them again and stuff, I don't think it was as great and nostalgic for me as it would have been in, say, a 10.2. And so that's why it's got to belong in a tier below. Shout out to Caius, though. Caius was a really good villain. Great, like, cool design, great voice acting, cool story once you find out more of the details, but it's not enough to turn it around for me. So C tier for 13.2. 13.3. Oh, okay. 13.3, I'm going to put here in B tier. This one might be a little bit controversial for some because I think it's one of the worst reviewed Final Fantasies of this mainline list. It's got really bad reviews. 13.3, I think when I first played it, and for most, if you do like a blind run of this game, like without any guides, anything, I think this game belongs in the D tier, right? But for me, I played it a second time for the channel, and I played it with a guide, and I really understood that there isn't as much time stress in this game as you think there is. It imposes it on you, but it's not as real as you think. And if you play with a guide, and you're able to map out your time in a way where you're not stressed about it, you don't look at the clock constantly, and you don't skip things out of fear of like potentially ruining it and getting a game over or wasting time, then you really unlock, I think, the true potential of this game, where you get to do the side quests, you interact with the world, and you realize that the side quests are a lot more fun and interesting than you might have originally thought, and it really helps with the world building. And I think the world building of 13.3 is much better than it gets given credit for, but it's mostly the game's own fault that that's the case. But because I did get to play it in that way, it definitely elevated my experience of 13.3. And so I definitely have to increase my kind of rating for 13.3 based on the fact that I played it a second time with a guide and really got to enjoy everything that it had to offer. So I do think it is a good game, but it needs to be played the right way. Final Fantasy 15, gotta go C tier here. I'll put it above 13.2. I did like the core like experience, like the road trip with the boys. Like, I think that's a cool idea, and it's not really one that had been done before. We had kind of the girl power one in 10.2. Now we had the boys in 15. I did like that, but I think the open world just wasn't good enough. I didn't enjoy it as much. I played the game at launch, so I didn't play like the Royal Edition with like the missing kind of cutscenes and extra stuff in there. So my experience of it, like the launch day experience, just wasn't as good as it could have been. There was definitely a feeling of kind of incompleteness by the time you got to the end. I think the story was good. It had some strong elements, like again, the bond between the characters and, you know, the ideas of sacrifice and all this stuff was nice. But I think some of the character interaction, like outside of the core group, like for example, Noctis and Luna Freya, I don't think that relationship particularly worked. Just like the other peripheral characters, I just think like as an overall, it just wasn't that strong. The gameplay is one of my least favorite of the series. I did not like their kind of action take on gameplay. The magic turned into like tossing items and stuff. Like it really wasn't it for me. And so the gameplay wasn't there. The story I think was decent, but like not quite there. It did feel a bit incomplete. Didn't really have the side quests and the post game that I would have liked. Like it is there to some extent, but I just didn't enjoy it enough to really engage with it that much. And so even though the DLCs did go some way to helping, and by the end, once I finished the Arden DLC, I was left kind of feeling a bit sad that we couldn't get a game, like truly the game that could have come from this. There was a lot of potential there, especially once you learn about the true nature of Arden and his story. But what we got given on release day in 2016, for me, was C tier when I'm comparing it with the rest of the games. Did I have generally a decent, good experience? Yeah, I did. But if I'm comparing it to the other ones and what it could have been, and the legacy that it has, like my desire to go back and play 15 again, it's just not there, unfortunately. So it stays in the C tier. Next up is Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, this is where it starts to get really difficult for me, because this is an A tier game. I think somewhere like here or here. I think probably here. Remake, I think in terms of the remake aspect is very strong. Like the way that they remade all of the locations, they recreated the characters from obviously the PS1 classic, the soundtrack, the dialogue, like the extra stuff that we managed to get in Remake that wasn't in the original, the extra chapters, like for example when we got to bond more with Avalanche and meet those guys, there was a lot of really good stuff in terms of the remake aspect, which I definitely enjoyed. The gameplay is my favorite take on modern Final Fantasy, and so that already obviously just shoots it up the rankings, because I really feel like they started to find more of a balance of bringing in more kind of tempo, action, speed, but also not kind of completely losing that more kind of measured style where you can actually select spells, you can use buffs and debuffs, and it still felt to me like the ability to just slow it down once you filled up an ATB bar really changed everything, and it felt like a really nice hybrid between the systems of like 7, 8, 9, and much more modern action-based games. So I think Remake did those things very well. I think the reason it's not even higher is just mostly because they forced basically the Midgar section to be an entire game. I think that created too much issues in terms of padding to try and make it a full game. It also affected Sephiroth's like introduction and presence in the early part of the game. It just doesn't work as well as the original, I think. And of course they have like the stuff with the whispers and all of that business, which I never was particularly a fan of. But since it's obviously building off one of my favorite casts of all time in Final Fantasy VII, and they got so much of the remake aspect right, and it just felt so awesome to be kind of walking through and experiencing these kind of modern day remade versions of locations that I knew and loved from 7, that like Remake for me was just very strong first part of the trilogy, although of course I still wish that they found a way to kind of have less padding, or to just make it 2 games instead of 3, so that you didn't need to kind of do it this way. But it is what it is. I still think it's a strong game, and I really enjoyed my time with Remake. Now, 16. Oh man, this is a tough one. I think it's either here or it's here. I think it's one of these games. 16's in a very weird place for me. I think in terms of actually like moment-to-moment feeling when I'm playing the game and the story, it was really, really good. Like there were moments when this game felt like A+ S tier. But I think it was so focused on moments that it kind of, I think, still lost a little bit of what happens in between. So like, if say moments, for me at least, they make up 20% of the game. And when I say moments, I mean like, let's say particularly emotional cutscenes or important cutscenes or important boss fights. 80% of the game is still like running around, traversal, random encounters, all of that stuff. It felt to me like that stuff was more like B/C tier, but the 20% was more like A+ S tier. And so that's why I find it in a very weird place. Like, it had some truly epic moments, and some of those boss fights and stuff, like, I've never experienced anything like that in Final Fantasy ever. And so that aspect, plus, I think, even though the party aspect was weak, the overall community feeling, like when you go to the hideout, and the characters that you meet and build bonds with throughout that story, that aspect I felt was really strong. So like characters like, for example, Tomes, which I'm a big fan of, I really liked those types of characters in the game. But if you're talking about, we didn't really have a party, and even when we had some characters that are very close to Clive joining in, it just didn't feel right. It was a little bit stale. So like, it's in this very weird mixed place, but the bits that it did do well, it did so well that it really left like an impression on me, and I really remember those like most epic 20% of moments. But I think because the overall experience still, I think, lacked kind of the JRPG depth in terms of its gameplay, it was a little bit too action-oriented for me. Didn't have enough like elemental affinities or buffs and debuffs. It was a little bit too reliant on just like fast-paced combos and blocking and parrying and all of that stuff. It just felt to me like everything was in service of the moment. And the thing about moments is that they're transitory and they end, and once those moments have ended, you can never really relive them in the same way again. And so for 16, that's why my biggest worry has always been, I feel like the legacy of this game might not be as strong, because I've already experienced like the epic heights of those boss battles, and I know it's never going to feel the same again, so I kind of don't have much of an urge to replay them again for that epic factor. And then all the other stuff in between, just like, it was good, but it wasn't great. And so I don't have that stronger desire to play through 16, because I'm like, I've done the story, had some great moments, generally had a great time, great performances, but that's kind of it. And so I think for me, with the absolute great games, I have more of a desire to play them again. And so for 16, that's why it ends up in this weird spot where I did really enjoy it, but I can't put it in like the top, like the absolute top tiers. So I think I'll leave it at that for 16. That one's definitely subject to change. I think it could slip down to maybe more of a B tier or the bottom of the A tier in like another 3 to 5 years. But for now, I'm going to keep it there. And finally, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. This one, I'm going to stay true to my word and put it in A+ tier. I said when I finished it that I think this is probably the best Final Fantasy I've played since Final Fantasy X, and I still believe that for now. Rebirth, I've already said a lot of positive things about Remake. Almost all of that still applies for Rebirth, and they built on it even more. So we have more characters, we've been able to expand out into the open world, and the scale and ambition of the world of Rebirth is truly mind-blowing. I couldn't believe the scale and the detail of the world of Rebirth, and they just did such an amazing job again with all of those aspects. I think the cast members, again, like I already loved the cast, but the new ones that were introduced, they were still great. I really enjoyed having them in the team. There was a greater focus on the team and growing bonds and doing things together. It led to some really nice interactions, to some nice moments. There was just a great amount of like humor and just like positive, fun moments between the group as well. And so given that it's like the middle child of a trilogy, and there is no beginning and there is no end of this story because you're literally stuck in the middle, I think they did just about as good a job as anyone could have hoped for with this one. I really enjoyed it. My main criticism still was that there's just too much of it. I think like 30% or so of the game is just too much. But despite that, like this game's ability to just keep going and just keep presenting you with new things to do that, for the most part, I was generally interested in doing. Like, for example, I think I was at 80, 90 hours in, and then the whole pirate thing revealed itself, and Gilgamesh Island and that kind of thing. And there's very few games where after 80 or 90 hours I'm still invested and I'm still like actively seeking out what to do. So it did go a bit overboard, I admit, but I think a lot of what 7 Rebirth did was truly great. Just getting to experience that part of the story, and with all of like the different additions and stuff that they've made, was definitely super cool, and I think it was one of my favorite Final Fantasy experiences for a very long time. Now, where the story will go, I really don't know. I have this kind of unshakable belief still that it's all going to kind of end up resulting in the same kind of thing that happened in the original, because Rebirth did, again, like we had a lot of things happening that didn't in the original, but I don't think that necessarily means that it's going to completely end in a different way. I'm still kind of hopeful that all of this stuff was just a different way, like a different take of retelling ultimately the same story. And because that's where I'm at in terms of story, I'm still happy, but it remains to be seen. If they really kind of screw up the story in the last game, it might cause me to obviously have more of a sour feeling about Rebirth's story long term, and I might start to enjoy it a little bit less. So Rebirth, again, longer term, might slip down to like here or something like that. Because I think newer games, they just take time to settle. A lot of these games, that they've been out for so long, and they've really established their place as well. And so I think it's always harder to put newer games in there, because if once I've played, let's say, 5 more Final Fantasy games on top of these, how am I going to feel about them? Only time will tell. But for now, I think this is the Dansg08 Final Fantasy tier list. Let me have one final look before I move on. Okay, so I've spent like a minute just staring at this and looking at all of them, and I think for now, I will lock this in and I will commit to it. And as I say, maybe I will revisit this in like 5 years' time, and we'll take a look and we'll see if anything has changed. But for now, this is the list, and I will hand you over to the outro that I previously recorded so we can wrap up this video. So there we go, my friends. That was my tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It's a new thing for me. It's a little bit kind of nerve-wracking to put something out there like this because in general, when I share my opinions on these games, they tend to be within the flow of a walkthrough. There's always much more context. So when I'm talking about something or evaluating it, you would have hopefully watched me basically play through the game in the first place, and you'll get to see my opinions a little bit more in context and real time with the game. But now just sort of coming out with these sort of lists and opinions, and there might be people who've just joined for the first time. They've never actually watched me play the games. It's obviously a little bit more kind of, I'm curious to see how people are going to respond to that kind of thing. But hopefully you guys enjoy it. And maybe if you haven't seen any of the playthroughs before, it might inspire you to go and have a look and see how I felt about it in real time as I was actually playing the game. So yeah, that is the tier list. We are hopefully going to do more of this stuff. And I hope this was a nice first entry into the Dansg08 ranking / tier list era for you guys. So I will see you soon. Thank you all for watching. Take care.